reason and fact. From the hour of their birth, some are marked out for subjection, others for rule. There's your reason, there's your fact. Book 1, chapter 13. As for women, quote, although there may be exceptions to the order of nature, a few weird ones, there's always that woman who they find out he was a she and she was general of an army or something. There's a few weirdos like that slip in. And there are always some men who may not want the male role, let's say. But Aristotle goes on, although there may be some exceptions to the order of nature, there may be, the male is by nature fitter to command than the female. The courage of a man is shown in commanding, of a woman in obeying. It's not exactly an equivocal statement here, is it? And before we dismiss such notions as hopelessly outmoded, recall the traditional marriage ceremony in vogue until recently, and by the way still used by many people, where a woman pledges to love, honor, and obey her husband. Oddly enough, today there's, by the way, a strain of radical separatist feminism, which doesn't speak for all feminism, but it does argue a biologically deterministic position, that women are free of the aggressiveness and power tripping that is inherent in male behavior, that women are the nurturers and purveyors of the finer, gentler virtues, opponents of patriarchal violence. Joanna Brenner has a nice criticism of that position, especially of Andrea Dworkin and Adrian Rich. They argue male creativity lies in the appropriation of women's energy and subsequent spiritual annihilation. When Dworkin writes, quote, men love death, she's not speaking metaphorically. There's something about being a male that leads to the pursuit of death. And these arguments, by the way, as Joanna Brenner points out, these arguments assume a feminine essence connected to women's childbearing capacities. And that because of that feminine essence, you get this biologically deterministic higher virtue than anything you could hope for in a male. By the way, to be sure, there is such a thing as male aggression. And male aggression against women is real and is of epidemic proportions, Holocaust proportions in this society, and it does have a biological base in that males are usually stronger. But it also has a social dimension in that they can get away with it. And they live in a culture that encourages such violent possessiveness and abuse of women and treats it as, and has too often treated it as normal or as a private family matter. That model, however, which I don't want to deny male aggression, that model, however, doesn't, I think, operate and doesn't explain history and doesn't explain the larger questions of politics that even people like Aristotle were trying to deal with. And I don't accept the idea of a female essence that's grounded in childbirthing, which is the source of male creativity, which men use to destroy women, etc. I mean, that's a little too heavy for this hour of the day anyway. Okay. Sometimes the privileged and powerful elements have saw the nature of the natural order itself, not just human nature, but the whole entire natural order is called in to justify existing social relations. In many ancient societies in which property relations were often justified by totem myths and myths of creation. And these were used so that those with more property could justify their greater property holdings or their higher status or their privileged status. They would be the descendants from the moon gods, and you people down there with very little property, you were descendants from whatever, the rodent totem or whatever kind of thing. So often you'll find in many ancient societies that the rulers will claim a celestial pedigree, that they claim to be specially placed in regard to divine forces. That was true of European society for about 1,000 years, the period of divine monarchy, where the monarch literally claimed a direct link to God's authority, that his sovereignty came directly as an endowment from God. It took centuries of struggle, and how many battles, how many killings, how many burnings at the stake, how many people fighting heroically to finally get sovereignty turned around and the truth coming out that namely the source of his power and his wealth came from the people on whose backs he lived. But that hierarchy was taken as so natural that it reflected God's order, the natural order, the divine law, and the natural law. The Chinese landlords William Hinton points that out. The Chinese landlords used to have a saying, the sun cannot rise in the west. It was something they said to the serf. They said, the sun, you cannot change places with me. You cannot hope for the life I have or the position I have, because no more than you could hope for the sun rising in the west. It is as unnatural as expecting the sun to rise in the west, and the sun cannot rise in the west. It follows that these elites are made of finer stuff than the serfs and peasants, and the latter are moral inferiors. Now then you got about 5 centuries of imperialism coming along. And imperialism was when the powers of Western Europe began to expropriate the land, labor, and wealth of Eastern Europe. That was the first area of expansion and exploitation that they went into. And the second was the New World. And then having developed all the superior firepower and mobility and transportation, they went then into Africa and Asia and further into Latin America. And with this imperialism, which is a history that really, to read the history of modern imperialism, as is still going on today, as organizations, worthwhile organizations like the Christic Institute are fighting that very same imperialism today in Central America and such. To read that history is really to read a history of a succession of the most horrendous, horrible atrocities that one can imagine. Now, when the ruling classes of these imperialist nations plundered and exploited the land, the labor, the natural resources, and the markets of other people, when they enslaved their labor, when they burned their villages, when they destroyed their industries and their crafts and their mines and their herds and their crops, when they raped them and murdered them and mutilated them, when they did all that sort of thing, and they worked them to death in the latifundios and plantations and in the mines, then theories had to come along to justify what you were doing. And the theories about these lesser races proliferated. These lesser races were animals. They were cruel savages. They were incapable of self-governance. They were like pathetic, helpless children. They'd been around living in peace for, 5,000 years before you came along, but suddenly now they wouldn't be able to get along without us. They were devoid of the normal sensibilities that one might expect from a person in civilized societies. Again, not an anachronistic attitude. In my own lifetime, in your lifetime of most of you, the adult lifetime of most of you, General Westmoreland, you remember him? In Vietnam, your average Asian, the Asian doesn't place the same importance on life as we Americans do. That's your average Asian. And with the massive bombings and saturation bombings, a war of horror and attrition and mass slaughter, he was pointing out that indeed one of those two protagonists did not place the same value on life as the other, but he had it mixed up, that's all. And with imperialism, there came in the 19th century the class-based, racist, patriarchal theories about human nature, known as science. Science came along and rushed in there with measurements of skulls and brain sizes. Whites were superior to blacks, males were superior to women, men of substance were superior to men of poverty. Race, gender, and class again. 19th century science gave us a great scientist, by the way, who took human beings out of the medieval metaphysical scheme of things and made them part of the natural order of things. And in a sense, it was a very revolutionary and very progressive thing that he did. A very great contribution, Charles Darwin. But a closer reading of some of the other things Darwin said, in his Descent of Man, for instance, definitely shows him to be a product of 19th century science, which in turn is a product of 19th century imperialism and capitalism and upper-class white male Europeans. Darwin, quote, "Man is more courageous, pugnacious, and energetic than woman, and has a more inventive genius." This is the best scientific mind of the 19th century in England, British Royal Society. "Men are superior in every activity requiring deep thought, reason, or imagination," except imagination about women, I guess. "Men vastly excel in the sciences, philosophy, history, the arts, poetry, painting, and sculpture." Ready? Sisters, are you ready? Women excel in tenderness, unselfishness, intuition, imitation, and other qualities that are characteristic